You guys just keep asking for the more Reddit stories. So, I'm ready with the new tale. Let's read some cool, interesting cheating wife Reddit stories. And guys, I'm trying to hit 1,000 subs before the end of the year, and I think we can do it. So please subscribe and let's get straight into this one.
The summer heat that year was relentless. Our dacha, nestled in the middle of a small village just outside the city, became our retreat from the chaos of urban life. It wasn't much, 2 modest rooms, a tiny kitchen, and a vast garden where we toiled under the sun, growing everything from tomatoes to cucumbers. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours, and I thought it was enough. My wife, Katia, had always been the social butterfly of our marriage. While I preferred the quiet hum of work in the greenhouse or tinkering with tools in the shed, she thrived on conversations with our neighbors. She'd often linger at the fence, chatting with Ivan, the man who owned the dacha next to ours. Ivan was in his mid-40s, wiry and sharp-eyed, with a laugh that echoed louder than the cicadas. It started innocently enough. Ivan would offer advice about our garden, gifting us buckets of ripe strawberries or freshly harvested potatoes. I didn't think much of it, neighborly kindness, nothing more. Katia was polite in return, sometimes spending hours talking about fertilizers, crop rotations, or the best time to plant zucchini. I found it amusing. Ivan was a harmless old flirt, or so I thought. The day everything began to shift was one of those rare, perfect summer afternoons. The air smelled of blooming jasmine, and the only sound was the faint rustle of the birch trees surrounding the dacha. I was bent over a stubborn patch of weeds in the garden when I heard Katia's laugh, light, melodic, and distinctly different from how she usually sounded around me. I glanced up to see her leaning over the fence, her face illuminated with an unfamiliar energy. Ivan stood on the other side, grinning like a schoolboy, his hands resting on the worn wood. He said something I couldn't hear, and she threw her head back, laughing again. Something in me tightened, but I quickly shook it off. She was just being friendly, right? By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, Katia had invited Ivan over for tea. I wasn't thrilled, but I didn't object. Hospitality was an unspoken rule of dacha life, and Ivan, for all his loudness, had been helpful. We sat at the wooden table under the pergola, the warm glow of our lantern casting shadows on the weathered planks. Ivan dominated the conversation, as usual. He told stories about his youth, his adventures in the army, and his late wife, all while pouring himself generous servings of my homemade cherry liqueur. Katia listened intently, her eyes sparkling in a way that unsettled me. When Ivan complimented her gardening skills, her cheeks flushed. That night, as we lay in bed, Katia seemed distant. She stared at the ceiling, her fingers tracing absent patterns on the blanket. I asked if something was wrong, but she just shook her head, offering a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. I wanted to press her, but exhaustion from the day's work silenced me. Looking back, that was the first crack in the facade of our life. I ignored it, choosing instead to bury myself in the physical labor of the garden. Little did I know, that summer would unearth secrets I never imagined. Secrets that would destroy everything I held dear. As the days stretched into weeks, I noticed subtle changes in Katia. She was spending more time near the fence, her conversations with Ivan becoming longer, filled with laughter and occasional whispers that I couldn't quite catch. When I asked what they talked about, she waved it off with a dismissive shrug. Just gardening, she said. He knows so much about it. But it wasn't just the conversations. She began taking more care in her appearance, even in the blistering heat of summer. Katia had always been practical, hair tied back in a simple braid, old clothes suited for digging in the dirt. Now she wore sundresses that clung to her figure and applied lipstick before heading out to the garden. I told myself it was just her trying to feel good about herself, but the nagging doubt in my mind refused to be silenced. One sweltering afternoon, I decided to work on repairs in the old shed at the back of our property. The roof leaked during rainstorms, and I had been meaning to fix it for months. As I hammered away at the loose shingles, I caught glimpses of Katia and Ivan through the dirty glass of the window. They stood by the greenhouse, their heads close together. Ivan gestured animatedly, and she laughed, her hand brushing his arm. Something about the way they stood, so close, too familiar, made my chest tighten. I told myself to stop being ridiculous. Ivan was just a neighbor, a helpful one at that. But the doubt festered, a shadow I couldn't ignore. The turning point came one evening when a storm rolled in. The rain pounded against the roof, and the power went out, plunging the dacha into darkness. Katya and I lit candles and sat by the window, watching the lightning streak across the sky. I thought it would be a quiet, intimate night, just the two of us. But then there was a knock at the door. It was Ivan, soaked to the bone and grinning sheepishly. He claimed he'd come to check if we needed anything during the storm, though I couldn't imagine why. He had never been the type to worry about others before. Katya insisted he stay for dinner, her voice warm and inviting, while I bit back the urge to tell him to leave. We ate by candlelight, the three of us huddled around the table. Ivan regaled us with tales of his younger days, his laughter echoing in the dim room. Katya hung on every word, her gaze fixed on him as if he were the most fascinating man in the world. I tried to join the conversation, but it felt like I was intruding on something private, something I didn't belong to. After dinner, Ivan lingered. Katya poured him another cup of tea, and they sat together, their voices low and intimate. I excused myself, pretending I needed to check on the shed, but really, I just couldn't stand being in the room with them any longer. Outside, the rain had let up, leaving the air thick with humidity. I stood in the shed, staring blankly at the tools lining the wall, my mind racing. Was I imagining things? Or was there something between them? When I finally went back inside, Ivan was gone. Katya was tidying up the table, humming softly to herself. She looked up at me and smiled, but there was something in her expression, a secret she wasn't sharing. I didn't say anything, swallowing the bitter taste of suspicion that had lodged itself in my throat. That night, as she slept beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The storm had passed, but the unease in my chest remained. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the life we had built together was starting to unravel. The next morning, I resolved to confront her. But when I opened my mouth to ask, she stopped me with a kiss, her hands gentle on my face. "I'm sorry if I've been distant," she said softly. "You know how much this garden means to me. It's been consuming." Her words, her touch, they disarmed me. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that I was overreacting, that the doubts clouding my mind were just paranoia. But deep down, I knew there was more to it. In the days that followed, Katya seemed to make an effort to be closer to me. She cooked my favorite meals, joined me in the greenhouse, and even laughed at my jokes, the way she used to when we first got married. For a moment, it felt like we were finding our way back to each other. But it was all an illusion. Late one evening, as I was walking back from the village store, I saw Ivan's car parked near our dacha. The lights were off, and the house was quiet. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. From the shadows, I saw movement in the greenhouse, the faint glow of a lantern flickering against the glass. I crept closer, my breath shallow, and peered through the crack in the door. What I saw made my blood run cold. Katya and Ivan, standing too close, their hands intertwined, their faces inches apart. The lantern cast their shadows long and distorted against the walls, but there was no mistaking the intimacy between them. I stepped back, my heart hammering, the world spinning around me. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, none of them making sense. How had we gotten here? How had I let this happen? I didn't confront them that night. I couldn't. Instead, I walked back to the house, each step heavier than the last. I sat in the dark, waiting for her to come inside, trying to piece together what I had just seen. When she finally came in, her cheeks were flushed, her hair slightly tousled. "Ivan just left," she said casually, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. I nodded, my voice caught in my throat. But that night I knew. Whatever we had, whatever trust had once bound us together, was gone. And the storm brewing inside me the days that followed were a haze. I went through the motions, watering the plants, repairing the greenhouse, pretending life was normal. But every moment was shadowed by the image of Katya and Ivan in the greenhouse, their faces close, their hands entwined. I replayed that scene in my head over and over, each repetition tightening the knot in my chest. Katya, for her part, acted like everything was fine. She woke early to make tea, brought me snacks while I worked, and chatted about her plans for the garden. But there was a subtle shift in her demeanor, a nervous energy that betrayed her. She avoided my eyes more often and would excuse herself for long walks in the evening, always saying she needed time to think or gather wildflowers for the table. I didn't confront her. Not yet. I wanted to be sure before I turned my suspicions into accusations. So, I waited and watched, biding my time like a hunter stalking prey. One afternoon, as Katya worked in the garden, I found myself wandering toward the greenhouse. The sunlight streamed through the glass, illuminating the rows of tomato plants and cucumber vines. It was our sanctuary, the place where we had built so much together. But now, it felt tainted, like a crime scene. In the far corner, something caught my eye, a crumpled piece of paper tucked between the pots. I picked it up, smoothing the creases, and my stomach sank as I read the hastily scrawled note. Tomorrow at noon. The shed. Don't tell anyone. It wasn't signed, but I didn't need a signature. The handwriting wasn't Katya's. It was bold, uneven, undoubtedly Ivan's. My fist clenched, the paper crumpling again in my grip. The shed. My shed. The thought of them using a space I had built with my own hands filled me with a rage I struggled to contain. But I forced myself to stay calm. This was my proof, my chance to uncover the full extent of their betrayal. That night I barely slept. Katya curled up beside me, her breathing soft and steady, while my mind raced with plans. By morning, I had made up my mind. I would confront them, but not until I saw it with my own eyes. At noon, I pretended to leave for the village, telling Katya I needed to buy supplies. She barely looked up from her weeding, nodding absently. I walked down the dirt road, my steps slow, my heart pounding, and then doubled back, cutting through the woods to approach the shed from behind. The closer I got, the more I felt like I was walking into a nightmare. The shed's door was slightly ajar, sunlight filtering through the gaps in the wooden slats. I could hear voices, low, muffled, but I couldn't make out the words. I crept closer, careful not to make a sound, until I was just outside the door. Inside, Ivan leaned against the workbench, his shirt unbuttoned, his posture casual. Katya stood opposite him, her arms crossed, her cheeks flushed. "We can't keep doing this," she said, her voice trembling. "Why not?" Ivan replied, his tone light, almost teasing. "He doesn't suspect a thing." Katya hesitated, glancing toward the door. For a moment I thought she might turn and see me, but Ivan reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and she froze. "You worry too much," he said. "We'll figure it out." My blood boiled. I wanted to burst in, to tear them apart, to scream at both of them for turning my life into a farce. But I held back, my hands gripping the doorframe, nails digging into the wood. I needed to hear more, to let them dig their own. I stood frozen outside the shed, gripping the doorframe so tightly my knuckles ached. Their voices mingled with the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Part of me wanted to burst in right then, to let my rage erupt and confront them in the moment. But another part, a colder, more calculating part, knew I needed to hear more. If I acted too soon, they might twist the truth, deny everything. Inside, Ivan's voice softened, taking on a tone that made my skin crawl. "You deserve more, Katya," he said, brushing her arm with his fingers. "He doesn't appreciate you." "Not like I do." Katya shook her head, her voice shaky. "It's not that simple, Ivan. He's my husband. I don't even know how this happened. It happened because it was meant to," Ivan said, leaning closer. "Don't you feel it? This connection between us? You can't ignore it forever." I clenched my teeth so hard I thought they might crack. Hearing him speak to her like that, as if he had some claim over her, as if he were better than me, it was almost unbearable. But Katia's response was what cut me the deepest. "I don't know what I feel," she whispered. "I just know it's wrong. And yet here you are." I've encountered, his voice a seductive purr. The silence that followed was deafening. I didn't need to see them to know what was happening. My stomach churned, my hands trembling with fury. How could she do this to me? After everything we'd built together, after all the years I had given her? I didn't wait to see any more. I stepped back from the shed, retreating into the trees. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, mocking the darkness in my heart. I needed time to think, to decide how to handle this betrayal. Storming in now would only make things worse. I needed a plan, something that would make them regret what they'd done. When I returned to the dacha later that afternoon, Katia was in the garden, humming to herself as if nothing had happened. She looked up when she saw me, smiling, and for a moment I almost believed it was genuine. "How was the village?" she asked, brushing dirt from her hands. "Fine," I replied, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Quiet." We ate dinner together that evening, a meal that tasted like ash in my mouth. Katia chatted about the garden, the weather, the neighbors, all while avoiding my gaze. I nodded and grunted at the right moments, pretending to listen while my mind churned with plans. The next day, I began gathering evidence. I started small, checking her phone when she wasn't looking, searching for messages or calls from Ivan. She was careful, though, deleting everything that might incriminate her. But I wasn't deterred. I started keeping a journal, documenting every suspicious moment, every time she disappeared for a walk, or spent too long near the fence. I also began watching Ivan more closely. He was just as arrogant as ever, strolling around the village like he owned it, chatting with anyone who would listen. But I noticed the way his eyes lingered on Katia whenever they were near each other, the way his smile widened when she laughed at his jokes. One evening, I followed him when he left the dacha. He walked to the edge of the village, where an old, abandoned greenhouse stood, its glass panels shattered and overgrown with weeds. He slipped inside, and I waited, hidden in the shadows, until I saw Katia arrive a few minutes later. My heart sank. This wasn't just a passing flirtation. They had a routine, a place. This was calculated, deliberate. I crept closer to the greenhouse, my breath shallow, my fists clenched. Through the broken glass, I saw them standing close, their faces lit by the golden glow of the setting sun. Ivan reached for her, pulling her into an embrace, and this time, she didn't resist. Their lips met, and my world shattered. I turned away, unable to watch any more. My mind swirled with emotions, anger, betrayal, heartbreak, all tangled together in a storm I couldn't escape. I stumbled back to the dacha, my vision blurred, my chest tight. That night, as Katia lay beside me, her breathing steady and serene, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. I had to act. I couldn't let them continue to make a fool of me. But how? Confronting her outright wasn't enough. The next morning, I rose before dawn, my mind made up. If Katia and Ivan thought they could turn me into a passive spectator of their affair, they were sorely mistaken. I wouldn't confront them outright, not yet. First, I needed to sow the seeds of my revenge, to ensure their betrayal cost them everything. Katia was already outside, pruning the tomato plants, when I joined her. She turned and smiled, her expression warm and untroubled, as though her secret life wasn't unraveling before her eyes. It made my stomach churn. "Let's finish the repairs on the shed today," I suggested, my voice calm. "It's about time we got it back into proper shape." Her smile faltered for a split second, but she recovered quickly. "That's a great idea. I'll help once I'm done here." The shed. Their hideaway. I couldn't wait to strip it of its purpose, to turn it into something unrecognizable, just like they had turned our marriage into a farce. While Katia worked in the garden, I began emptying the shed. I moved the tools, the fertilizer bags, and the old wooden crates to the greenhouse. Then I cleared out the workbench, the same one Ivan had leaned on while whispering sweet lies to my wife. Every item I moved felt like an act of defiance, a way to reclaim what was mine. By mid-morning, Katia joined me. She hummed as she carried planks and handed me nails, acting as though we were a perfect team. I played along, offering smiles and small talk, all the while calculating my next move. I'm thinking we should turn this into a storage space for crops, I said, stepping back to survey the shed. We could build some shelves, maybe even a locking cabinet. Katia hesitated, her brow furrowing. A locking cabinet? Why would we need that? To keep everything secure, I replied smoothly. You know how things can go missing around here. People get curious. She nodded, though her eyes flicked toward the door, a hint of unease in her expression. Good. Let her wonder. By the end of the day, the shed was nearly unrecognizable. The workbench was gone, replaced by sturdy shelves. The window, once cracked and grimy, was cleaned and fitted with new glass. I even installed a heavy padlock on the door, dangling the key in front of Katia before slipping it into my pocket. There, I said, dusting off my hands. Now it's secure. She forced a smile, but I could see the tension in her jaw, the faint shadow of worry in her eyes. That evening, as we ate dinner, Katia seemed quieter than usual. She pushed her food around on her plate, barely meeting my gaze. I wanted to confront her, to throw the truth in her face, but I held back. Let her stew in her own guilt. The next morning, I took things a step further. As Katia lingered at the fence, chatting with Ivan, I headed into the village to talk to a few neighbors. I casually mentioned that Ivan had been spending a lot of time near our dacha lately, hinting that he might be interested in buying the place. You know how he is, I said with a chuckle. Always sticking his nose where it doesn't belong. The villagers ate it up. Gossip spread like wildfire in our little community, and by the end of the day, Ivan's name was on everyone's lips. That evening, Ivan approached me as I worked in the garden. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by a nervous energy. I hear you've been saying things about me, he began, his tone guarded. I stood, wiping my hands on my pants. Just the truth, I replied. People notice when you're always hanging around here. Can't blame them for wondering what you're up to. He narrowed his eyes, but before he could say anything, Katia appeared, carrying a basket of cucumbers. Her gaze darted between us, her smile tight. Everything okay? She asked. Just fine, I said, my tone light. Ivan was just leaving. He glared at me but said nothing, turning on his heel and walking away. Katia watched him go, her shoulders tense, and I could see the conflict playing out on her face. Over the next few days, the tension between us grew. Katia spent more time in the garden, her movements hurried and distracted. Ivan, meanwhile, became a ghost. He stopped coming around, and I heard through the village grapevine that he was avoiding everyone, claiming he had too much work to do. I should have felt satisfied, but the fire in my chest burned hotter with every passing day. They hadn't paid enough. Not yet. One night, as Katia slept beside me, I slipped out of bed and retrieved the crumpled note I had found in the greenhouse. It was time to put the final pieces of my plan into motion. Their betrayal had started in secret, and that's how it would end. Quietly. Ruthlessly. And when it was done, there would be no doubt who had the upper hand. The quiet of the dacha felt oppressive in the days that followed. Katia's footsteps seemed softer, her voice quieter, as though she could sense the storm brewing beneath my calm facade. I played my part well, continuing our routine as though nothing was amiss, while behind the scenes, I carefully laid the groundwork for what was to come. The crumpled note I'd found became my tool, my weapon. It was time to bait the trap. Late one evening, as Katia cleaned up in the kitchen, I crept out to the shed with a pen and scrap of paper. In a scrawling hand that could pass for Ivan's, I wrote a new note: tomorrow. Midnight. The greenhouse. I folded it neatly, smudging it slightly to make it look authentic, and tucked it into her gardening gloves. If Katia found the note, her curiosity, or her guilt, would do the rest. The next day was unbearably normal. We weeded the beds, tended to the greenhouse, and made a trip to the village for supplies. Katia smiled and chatted as though everything was fine, but I saw the flicker of doubt in her eyes when she thought I wasn't looking. She was distracted, her gaze lingering on the gloves where I had left the note. I didn't say a word. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, she was fidgety, her movements hurried as she cleaned up the day's work. I pretended not to notice, finishing my tea and heading to bed early, leaving her to stew in her thoughts. Around midnight, I heard the faint creak of the floorboards. I opened my eyes, staring at the ceiling as the sound of her footsteps receded into the distance. She was careful, but not careful enough. The faint squeak of the back door confirmed what I already knew: she was going to the greenhouse. I waited a few moments before slipping out of bed. My heart pounded in my chest, a mix of fury and anticipation driving me forward. I grabbed the flashlight I'd hidden in my pocket earlier that evening and stepped into the night. The air was cool, the moon casting long shadows over the garden. As I approached the greenhouse, I could see the faint glow of a lantern through the glass. My footsteps slowed, my breath shallow as I crept closer. Katia was inside, pacing nervously, the note clutched in her hand. She checked the time on her phone, biting her lip as she glanced toward the door. I stayed hidden in the shadows, watching as minutes ticked by. She seemed torn, her fingers trembling as she turned the note over and over. When it became clear that Ivan wasn't coming, because, of course, he had no idea she was there, her face crumpled in frustration. She stuffed the note into her pocket, blew out the lantern, and stormed out of the greenhouse. I slipped back into the darkness, retreating to the dacha before she could see me. My pulse raced as I climbed back into bed, feigning sleep when she returned minutes later. She lay down beside me, her movements stiff, her breathing uneven. I waited until the next morning to make my next move. Over breakfast, I casually mentioned the greenhouse. "I thought I heard someone out there last night," I said, my tone light. "Did you hear anything?" Katia froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. "No," she said quickly, her voice too bright. "Maybe it was an animal." "Maybe," I agreed, watching her squirm under my gaze. The cracks in her composure were growing. She was unraveling, and I took grim satisfaction in watching her struggle to maintain the facade. But I wasn't done yet. 2 days later, I planted the next seed. While Katia worked in the garden, I slipped into Ivan's yard, leaving a note on his porch. "Stop. He knows." The words were simple, cryptic, but enough to make him panic. Sure enough, that evening, Ivan showed up at our dacha, his face pale, his movements tense. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I led him to the garden, keeping my tone calm. "What's this about?" He glanced around nervously, his gaze darting toward the house. "Look, I don't know what you've heard, but it's not true. Whatever you think is happening, it isn't." I folded my arms, studying him. "What exactly do you think I've heard?" Ivan faltered, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for the right words. "Nothing," he said finally, shaking his head. "Forget it." But I didn't forget. His panic was all the confirmation I needed. He knew he was guilty, and he was running scared. That night, I confronted Katia. I waited until we were in bed, the house quiet and dark. "Katia," I said softly, my voice steady. She turned to face me, her expression wary. "Yes?" "I found something," I said, reaching under the mattress and pulling out the note she had hidden in her pocket. Her face drained of color as she saw it in my hand. "Where did you get that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I think the better question is why you had it," I replied coldly. She stammered, searching for an explanation, but I didn't let her finish. "I know, Katia," I said, my tone sharp. "I've known for weeks. Don't insult me by lying." Her eyes filled with tears, her shoulders shaking as she broke down. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she sobbed. "I swear, it didn't mean anything." "Didn't mean anything?" I spat, my anger finally boiling over. "You betrayed me, Katia. You humiliated me." "I'm sorry," she cried, her voice raw. "I'll end it. I promise. But her promises meant nothing to me anymore. I had seen the truth, and I couldn't unsee it. The only thing left was to make sure she and Ivan paid for what they had done. I let her cry herself to sleep that night, her pleas for forgiveness falling on deaf ears. My plan was almost complete, and when the time came, she would finally understand the price of betrayal. Katya's sobs echoed in my mind long after she had confessed, yes, but her tears brought no relief to my rage. Words were cheap. Promises, even cheaper. I wasn't satisfied with her hollow apologies or her pleas for forgiveness. She needed to understand what she had done, not just to me, but to everything we had built together. I rose before dawn, slipping out of bed as silently as a shadow. The day ahead would demand careful precision, every step of my plan orchestrated to perfection. I wasn't going to confront Ivan again. Not yet. That would come later, and it would be on my terms. In the greenhouse, I prepared the final pieces of my scheme. It wasn't just about punishment. It was about destruction, about ensuring neither of them could continue their charade. As the sun crept over the horizon, I stepped back to admire my handiwork, satisfaction blooming in the pit of my stomach like a twisted flower. By the time Katya woke, I was already in the kitchen, sipping tea and reading the paper. She entered hesitantly, her eyes puffy from the night before. "Morning," she murmured, her voice thick with guilt. "Morning," I replied, not looking up. My calmness seemed to unnerve her more than any anger ever could. She lingered in the doorway, fidgeting with the hem of her dress before shuffling to the table. "I'll make breakfast," she offered, her tone meek. "No need," I said, folding the paper neatly. "I've already eaten." The silence between us was heavy, the air thick with unsaid words. I knew she was waiting for me to bring it up again, to start another confrontation. But I didn't. I let her stew in her own discomfort, every passing minute tightening the noose around her guilt. By late afternoon, I had everything in place. I told Katya I was heading to the village to run some errands and left her working in the garden. Instead of going to the village, I went to Ivan's. He opened the door, his expression shifting from confusion to unease the moment he saw me. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice wary. "To talk," I said, pushing past him into the house. Ivan hesitated, then followed me to the living room. He crossed his arms, leaning against the wall as I paced in front of him. "You've been busy," I began, my tone cold. "I don't know what you're talking about," Ivan said, his jaw tightening. "Oh, I think you do," I replied, stopping to face him. "You've been playing a dangerous game, Ivan. And now, it's time to pay the price." His eyes narrowed, his bravado slipping. "Are you threatening me?" "I don't need to threaten you," I said, pulling out my phone. With a swipe, I showed him the pictures I had taken of him and Katya in the greenhouse, their embrace illuminated by the soft glow of the lantern. Ivan's face went pale. "You can't prove anything," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe not in court," I conceded. "But in the court of public opinion? This village thrives on gossip, Ivan. Imagine what people will say when they see these." He lunged forward, trying to grab the phone, but I stepped back, my lips curling into a cold smile. "Careful," I warned. "You don't want to make this worse for yourself." Ivan froze, his fists clenched at his sides. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice low. "Stay away from my wife," I said, my tone deadly serious. "If I catch you near her again, I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of man you really are." He glared at me, but there was fear in his eyes now. Without another word, I turned and walked out, my pulse racing. When I returned to the dacha, Katya was waiting for me. She stood by the fence, her hands wringing nervously. "Did you go to Ivan's?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I did," I said simply. "What did you say?" "Enough," I replied, brushing past her. Katya followed me inside, her footsteps hurried. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. Katya's voice cracked as she trailed me into the house, her words stumbling over one another. "Please, just tell me what you said to Ivan. Did you threaten him? What's going to happen?" I stopped in the middle of the kitchen, turning to face her. She stood there, her hands wringing together, her face pale. I studied her for a moment, marveling at how unfamiliar she had become to me. This wasn't the woman I thought I married. I told him to stay away from you, I said flatly. Her lips trembled, and she let out a shaky breath. That's it? You didn't do anything else? No, I lied smoothly. Not yet. Her brow furrowed, confusion mingling with fear. What do you mean, not yet? I leaned against the counter, my arms crossed. It means that whether or not I do more depends entirely on you. I need you to decide, Katya. Do you want to fight for this marriage, or do you want to keep sneaking around behind my back? Tears welled in her eyes as she shook her head. I don't want him, I swear. I made a mistake, one I'll regret for the rest of my life. But I want us. I want to fix this, I'll do whatever it takes. Her words might have sounded sincere to anyone else, but to me, they were empty. Just another attempt to placate me, to avoid facing the consequences of her actions. But I wasn't interested in fixing things anymore. I had a different goal in mind. Good, I said, my tone icy. Then you'll have no problem cutting ties with him completely. No more conversations, no more meetings. You won't even look in his direction again. Understood? She nodded, her tears spilling over. I promise. I'll do whatever you ask. I didn't respond. I simply turned and walked out of the room, leaving her to stew in her shame. That night, as Katya lay in bed beside me, her breathing slow and uneven, I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling. My mind raced with thoughts of what I had done, what I still intended to do. Ivan might have agreed to back off for now, but I knew his type. Men like him didn't take orders easily, and I couldn't trust Katya to resist if he came sniffing around again. The next morning, I left early, telling Katya I needed to help a neighbor with his tractor. It wasn't unusual for me to spend hours away from the dacha, so she didn't question it. Instead of heading to the neighbor's, I drove to Ivan's property. He wasn't home, which made things easier. His car was parked in the driveway, and his tool shed was locked, but I had come prepared. With a crowbar in hand, I forced the shed door open, my pulse steady as I stepped inside. Ivan's tools were neatly arranged on the walls, his workbench spotless. I picked up a hammer, weighing it in my hand, then set it back down. My real target wasn't here, it was his car. I worked quickly, puncturing the tires and pouring sugar into the gas tank. My hands moved with precision, fueled by an eerie calm. By the time I stepped back, Ivan's car was rendered useless, a silent declaration of war. The wrecked vehicle would be his first warning, a reminder that he was treading on dangerous ground. But I wasn't finished yet. As I closed the toolshed, my mind raced with possibilities. Ivan thought he could waltz into my life, take what wasn't his, and walk away unscathed. He needed to understand that actions have consequences, ones he wouldn't forget. I returned to the dacha just as the sun climbed higher, casting a golden glow over the garden. Katya was in the greenhouse, her back turned as she tended to the plants. She looked so serene, so normal, it almost made me laugh. How easily she slipped into her routines, as if she wasn't carrying the weight of betrayal on her shoulders. "Morning," I called, stepping into the greenhouse. She jumped slightly, spinning around with a nervous smile. "You're back early." "Everything went faster than expected," I replied casually. "How's it going in here?" "Good," she said, though her voice wavered. "The cucumbers are coming along nicely." I nodded, stepping closer until I could see the tension in her posture, the way her hands trembled ever so slightly as she adjusted the vines. She was terrified, of me, of what I knew, of what I might do. And she should be. Over the next few days, I noticed a shift in her behavior. She avoided the fence entirely, no longer lingering for chats with Ivan. She threw herself into the garden, the housework, anything to keep herself busy. But I wasn't fooled. The cracks in her resolve were widening, her guilt gnawing away at her piece by piece. Ivan, on the other hand, was nowhere to be seen. He didn't visit the dacha, didn't even cross paths with us in the village. The gossip had reached a fever pitch, and I made sure to fan the flames wherever I could. "Have you seen Ivan?" I asked one of the older women at the market, feigning curiosity. "He's been awfully quiet lately." She snorted, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Probably hiding from the mess he's made. I heard some nasty rumors about him and a married woman." I feigned surprise. "Really? That doesn't sound like him." She shook her head, her lips pursed. "Men like him always think they can get away with anything. But it always catches up with them." I couldn't have put it better myself. The breaking point came one rainy evening. Katya and I were sitting in the kitchen, the sound of rain pattering against the windows. She had been quiet all day, barely eating, her eyes darting toward me whenever she thought I wasn't looking. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling. "Did you do something to Ivan?" I set down my cup of tea, meeting her gaze. "Why would you ask that?" She hesitated, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "He hasn't been around. And his car, it was wrecked. He told people it was vandalized. Maybe he has other enemies," I said evenly. "He's not exactly well liked." Her eyes filled with tears, and she looked away, her voice breaking. "I don't know how we got here. How everything fell apart." I leaned forward, my voice cold. "We got here because of you, Katya. You made a choice. And now you have to live with the consequences." She started sobbing, her shoulders shaking as she buried her face in her hands. I watched her for a moment, the satisfaction I had anticipated failing to materialize. Instead, I felt an emptiness, a hollow ache that no amount of revenge could fill. I stood, leaving her at the table as I walked into the night. The rain soaked through my clothes as I made my way to the greenhouse, my thoughts a whirlwind of anger and regret. Everything I had built, my marriage, my life, was in ruins, and there was no putting it back together. Inside the greenhouse, I stood among the rows of plants, the air thick with humidity. The lantern flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to feel the weight of what had happened. Katya's betrayal had destroyed more than just our marriage. It had destroyed the man I used to be. When I returned to the dacha, Katya was gone. Her coat and boots were missing from the entryway, and her gardening tools lay abandoned on the porch. I searched the house, calling her name, but the only answer was the sound of the rain. She didn't come back that night, or the next. Days turned into weeks, and still, there was no sign of her. At first, I thought she might be with Ivan, but the villagers said he had left abruptly, packing up his belongings and disappearing without a word. Wherever Katya had gone, it wasn't with him. I should have felt relief, but all I felt was emptiness. The garden withered, the dacha grew silent, and the life I had known faded into the past. One evening, months later, I found a note tucked under the door. "I'm sorry. For everything. I couldn't stay. I hope you find peace someday." There was no signature, but I didn't need one. I burned the note in the fireplace, watching as the flames consumed the last remnants of my marriage. Katya and Ivan were gone, but their betrayal lingered, a ghost that haunted the empty halls of the dacha. And I was left to pick up the pieces of a life that no longer felt like my own.
Oh my god. Another really good one. I really hope you enjoyed this Reddit story video. I had a great time reading this. If you want more of this kind of content, just leave a comment, let me know. Follow my channel. I'm really trying to hit 1,000 subs before the end of the year. And we can do it. It's going to happen, guys. Thank you so much. Now, everybody have a great night and have a sweet dreams.